Power doesn't end when a man dies. Sometimes that's when it becomes untouchable. Jeffrey Epstein is dead, and yet his name still moves markets of attention, reshapes reputations, destabilizes trust in institutions. Dead men are not supposed to control narratives, but some of them do. Why does that happen? Why do certain powerful men become immune? Not just legally, but psychologically, even after exposure, even after disgrace, even after death. We're told that truth eventually wins, that facts rise to the surface, that justice, even if delayed, is inevitable. But that isn't what history consistently shows. Sometimes the most powerful position is not innocence, it's narrative control. And if you don't understand how that works, you'll keep mistaking visibility for accountability. Stay with me, because this isn't about conspiracy. It's about structure. Over the years, you begin to notice a pattern. Certain men accumulate power in ways that make them more than individuals. They become nodes, central points in a network of influence, secrets, transactions, favors, leverage. When that kind of man falls, the story doesn't end. It fragments, and fragmentation is protection. By the end of this, you'll understand why exposure doesn't always destroy power, why death can sometimes increase it, and why untouchable is less about law and more about psychology. We're going to look at 3 layers: the architecture of power, the mechanics of narrative, and the uncomfortable role the public plays in making certain men immortal. Each layer gets darker. Most people misunderstand power as position, a title, a seat, a public office. But real power is networked. Jeffrey Epstein did not hold public office. He was not a CEO of a visible empire. Yet he moved among presidents, billionaires, royalty, academics. That is not positional power. That is relational power. And relational power behaves differently. When you're deeply embedded in networks of influence, you become costly to expose. Not because you're innocent, but because exposure doesn't isolate you, it implicates others. This is where most people get it wrong. They assume the fall of one man threatens only that man. In reality, it threatens the ecosystem, and ecosystems defend themselves. When Epstein's past resurfaced in the news again and again, the story didn't clarify. It multiplied: old allegations, new documents, speculation layered onto fact. Notice something subtle. The more information surfaced, the less coherent the narrative became. That isn't always accidental. Complexity protects power. And this is only the first layer. Powerful men don't just accumulate influence. They accumulate ambiguity. Ambiguity is armor. If a story is clean and simple, it's dangerous. If it's tangled and overwhelming, it becomes exhausting. Look at how discussions around Epstein evolve. Some focus on confirmed crimes. Others spiral into global conspiracies. Others reduce everything to partisan talking points. Truth gets buried, not necessarily by lies, but by volume. When narratives fracture into dozens of competing explanations, accountability becomes diffuse. And diffuse accountability is almost indistinguishable from none at all. Here's the uncomfortable part. Even people who want justice can unintentionally protect power, because outrage without clarity feeds spectacle, and spectacle feeds confusion, and confusion is safer than precision. You might think death ends narrative control, but death often freezes a man in ambiguity. He can no longer speak, but everyone else can speak about him. And when too many voices compete, the center disappears. Untouchability is not only legal, it is psychological. Certain men become symbols. For some, Epstein represents corruption. For others, he represents institutional failure. For others still, he becomes a vessel for broader distrust of media, government, elites. Once a man becomes symbolic, attacking him is no longer just about him. It becomes an attack on the identities attached to the interpretation, and identity defends itself ruthlessly. When power merges with symbolism, it no longer depends on facts alone. It depends on loyalty. This is why even overwhelming evidence sometimes fails to create consensus, because consensus threatens identity, and identity is more important to most people than truth. Powerful men do not become untouchable alone. They are made untouchable by fascination, by obsession, by the constant recycling of their names. Every headline, every viral clip, every speculative thread extends their lifespan. Even in condemnation, we amplify. And amplification is a form of power transfer. This doesn't mean silence is virtue. It means attention is currency. When Epstein's name trends years after his death, something important is happening. He is no longer a man. He is infrastructure, a reference point, a shorthand, a narrative trigger. Infrastructure is harder to dismantle than individuals. And here's the question most people avoid. At what point does constant repetition stop being accountability and start becoming myth-making? Because myth is the final form of untouchability. Untouchability is not the absence of consequence. It is the presence of diffusion. When responsibility spreads across networks, when narrative fragments into factions, when identity attaches to interpretation, when attention converts individuals into symbols, no single point remains to strike. Even if a man is wrong, even if a man is guilty, even if a man is dead, the structure persists. That's why powerful men can change narratives from the grave, because they were never the only authors. They embedded themselves inside systems that survived them. And once embedded, removing the person doesn't remove the pattern. It's not about one name. It's about architecture. And architecture is rarely emotional. It is strategic. When you understand this, you stop waiting for dramatic endings. You stop expecting death to equal closure. You start looking at incentives, networks, information flows. You become less reactive, less outraged, more analytical. Because the real question is no longer, how did he get away with it? It becomes, what structures allowed this to be possible in the first place? And once you start asking that, the world becomes quieter, sharper, and slightly more unsettling. If this shifted how you see power, watch the next video on how institutions manufacture legitimacy. It builds directly on this. Most people will keep arguing about names. A few will start studying systems. Share this with someone who's ready for the second group. Most won't understand it, but the ones who do were never looking for noise in the first place.